other aspect of Project Apollo and its impact on the world, take a look at diplomacy and how it's impacted by Project Apollo. And to discuss that, we have the perfect person for that, Dr. Teasel Muir, a recent PhD from MIT, who's now moved on to the Smithsonian, and where she is the Apollo Collection Curator. And you may have noticed her book that came out this summer, Apollo to the Moon, A History in 50 Objects. It's a really interesting book. You'll probably find it on the Smithsonian gift shop all day. Highly recommend it. Dr. Muir.
Thanks so much for having me. I hope that you all come to visit us at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum this week during your visit to Washington. So I'm going to start today at a slightly different place. Usually when we talk about the Apollo program, we talk about what happened on the lunar surface, the EVAs, or we talk about what led to it and all the technological development necessary to make it happen. Instead, I'm going to start after the mission was a success and focus on what happened after the mission when the astronauts splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th, 1969. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the role that Apollo played in American diplomacy in 1969. So here you can see the spacecraft in the Pacific Ocean, and over to the right there, that's President Nixon. So he came to meet the crew when they splashed down. He was waiting for them at the aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. And he spoke to them when they were safely in quarantine, in the mobile quarantine facility. You can see them there through the window. And he first told them he felt like the luckiest person alive. And then immediately he went on to let them know that over 1,000 messages came from foreign governments, emperors, kings, prime ministers, and presidents, and some of the most warm he had ever seen, and that they represented the billions of people around the world who were following the flight. So as he pointed out, over half the world's population followed this mission. The international significance cannot be overstated. He mentioned that the world had never been closer together, and then he also told them, because of what had happened that week, he and others in the U.S. government, like the Secretary of State, William Rogers, can do their job better. So, what did he mean? How did the Apollo 11 mission make Nixon and the U.S. government's job a little better, a little easier? First, he found the space mission useful on a world tour that he embarked on as soon as he left the ship. And it was aptly named Moonglow. So after he was done speaking to the astronauts, he immediately flew to Guam. This was the first stop on a world tour that he took. That evening, at the top of the Officers Club in Guam, he gave remarks that would later become known as the Nixon Doctrine. So this is the first time he introduced this publicly. Basically, the United States would stop sending troops to Vietnam. There would be no more Vietnams. The U.S. would not enter a similar conflict in the future. And the U.S. would supply arms and assistance to threaten nations, but would expect their nations to supply their own people for military defense. And then he continued on for the rest of the trip. And throughout the rest of this trip, which took him to the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Romania, and the United Kingdom, Nixon drew on space themes to couch challenging foreign relations issues, especially the United States' role in Vietnam. Yes, thank you. So here's one example of him doing that. This is a speech from Manila in the Philippines. And as you can see here, he says, "As we think of the first man setting foot on the moon, we realize the meaning that it has, clearly apart from the technical achievement. We realize that if man can reach the moon, that we can bring peace to Earth." And this association of the Nixon administration's foreign relations goals and the success of Apollo were drawn on again and again throughout the rest of this mission, or the rest of this tour. So perhaps the most important stop of the tour was Romania. Nixon had hoped that if he went to Romania and he spoke with the head of state, Nicolae Ceausescu, that he could communicate through Ceausescu to China and North Vietnam that the United States was interested in normalizing relations. And he was preparing and excited for this weeks before. During the Apollo 11 mission, he called the astronauts on the lunar surface, and while he was speaking to them, he said the following words. He said, "As you talk to us from the Sea of Tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to Earth." And then a few hours later, he reflected that the tranquility point was important, especially in view of the Romania trip. So he was already preparing for that trip and its connection to Apollo. And this gives you a sense of how space and diplomacy were intertwined, as well as Nixon's expectation that space rhetoric was an important diplomatic instrument. And Ceausescu told Nixon that he would do everything he could to be helpful in furthering the U.S.'s relations with China and North Vietnam. When Nixon returned to Washington, he started getting involved in the astronauts' worldwide diplomatic tour, Giant Step. This was a meticulously choreographed political event. Nixon and his most trusted advisors, so National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, his chief of staff, many others took a hands-on role in selecting tour stops. And these were some of the most powerful men in the world in 1969, which attests to how the tour planning was geopolitical chess at the highest level. A few months earlier, requests and suggestions for tour stops came from members of Congress, ambassadors, and even foreign leaders. This is an example of sort of the kind of logic that went into selecting different tour stops. So this comes from Illinois Representative Paul Finlay, but he basically emphasizes the potential impact of the astronauts' visit to South America, the popularity of the mission, and how it might advance U.S. foreign relations interests there. And here's another example. So this is an assessment of whether or not the astronauts should be sent to a country in Eastern Europe. And it was a very, very popular mission there. And this document says, more than any other program since World War II, interest in the Apollo shots has proven too much for the regime to contain. The expectation was that it would be really critical to send the astronauts there, and it would have a potential impact. So here's their tour schedule, just to give you a sense of how intense it was and how many places they visited. Many locations they only stopped for one day. They wanted to make sure the astronauts were back in the United States in time for the Apollo 12 mission. But I'll just go through it very quickly. It was truly around the world. So Nixon had very high expectations for this diplomatic tour, but he was also a bit nervous. So he called Neil Armstrong the day before the astronauts were to depart on the tour, and he said that it was really essential that they, on the tour, emphasize that Project Apollo was an American mission in the benefit of all mankind, and to emphasize that there was also an interest in international cooperation, so to help further those goals. So the first stop on the tour was Mexico City in Mexico. You can see the astronauts here on the motorcade. They were very warmly received. They were given the key to the city. There was a big celebration. And then the next morning, they flew on to Bogota. And I should mention that during Apollo 11, Colombia's 230 radio stations broadcast coverage of the mission. And the launch of Apollo 11 on July 16th was the first live satellite broadcast in the country's history. And this is a theme repeated again and again at the stops. Then it was off to Argentina and Brazil. In Argentina, 1 of every 2 people watched live TV coverage of the astronauts' visit to Buenos Aires. And this was the most watched event in the country's history that was a non-sport event. And then they flew off to Europe. So they first stopped in Madrid. The crowds were so large that met them at the airport. They actually ended up breaking these glass walls in the airport near the door. There was so much enthusiasm. And in advance of the visit, a Spanish magazine distributed 2 posters of the crew. You can see one here, superimposed into Spanish scenes. And this was a gesture of adoption of the astronauts into local traditions or cultures. Throughout the mission and the tour, there were also efforts by the astronauts to link their mission to local cultures and history. So it went both ways. So when the astronauts visited Spain, they also visited the Christopher Columbus monument there and laid wreaths to connect their mission to Columbus's voyages. Then they stopped in Paris, and the reception there rivaled Charles Lindbergh's famous visit. Then after Paris, it was on to Amsterdam, and then Brussels, all on the same day. In Amsterdam, they did a watercade instead of a motorcade. You can see them here. And then to Germany, to Cologne and Bonn, and then Berlin. Here you can see them standing at the wall. And then to London and Rome and Belgrade. And Belgrade was the only visit in Eastern Europe. I believe they went hunting there. and then to Turkey, and then down to the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was the only stop in Africa, then off to Iran and India. In Bombay, they were welcomed by 2 million people, which was the largest reception ever in that city, and it surpassed the Pope's visit there. You can see this newspaper coverage. It's a big sports stadium and a full-scale reproduction of the lunar module. On the stop in Thailand, an editorial claimed that no American goodwill ambassadors have achieved such great success in promoting friendship, good understanding, and a feeling of joint responsibility among human beings as these astronauts. Similar reports came from many of the locations. Then to Australia and Guam, South Korea, Japan, before returning home to Washington, D.C. Reports called the tour a resounding success. Between 100 and 150 million people saw them on this worldwide tour to 24 countries. Henry Kissinger said that the visit of our astronauts abroad constitutes one of the effective policy vehicles available to us. Undersecretary of State, Alexis Johnson, said that the visit of the Apollo 11 astronauts to many nations have helped greatly in extending and deepening the sense of personal involvement of the peoples of the world in our space program. So after the worldwide tour, they came back here to Washington, D.C. They were greeted by Nixon again, this time at the White House for a small reception on the lawn. And Nixon called them the best ambassadors America could have. Later that night, they had a small dinner with President Nixon, and he told them about his meeting with Ceausescu in Romania. And he said that the popularity of their mission made it possible for him to have that meeting, and got him that meeting, which then helped improve U.S. relations with China and North Vietnam. And he made a comment that he said that meeting alone was worth everything we spent on the space program. And that's an overstatement. You've already heard from my colleagues earlier how much the Apollo program cost. But that statement really points to the ways that Nixon's relationship to Apollo and his expectations for its significant impact on U.S. foreign relations interests at that time. So just a few concluding remarks about Moonglow and Giant Step. So they help offset some negative press. The tours often made front page newspaper coverage and displaced coverage of Vietnam and some other issues that the United States found less appealing to be covered at the time. It was a way to reward allies, and it also shows us how space symbolism and rhetoric help communicate other political objectives. But perhaps most importantly, it encouraged a sense of participation in Apollo, and in turn, a more general identification with the United States and U.S. interests, which was part of Kennedy's objective in 1961 when he proposed Project Apollo. Thank you for your attention.
One of the most major signs we saw in parade, the precision, was we did it. Not you did, but we did.
personal testimony. Congratulations. Finally,